So in Sense and Sensibility, Willoughby is a total scoundrel, so much so that Colonel Brandon challenges him to a duel. That is right, they are going to fight. However, what was the etiquette around dueling? And if Colonel Brandon had actually killed Willoughby in this fight, would he have gone to prison or even faced the death sentence? Well, that is what we're talking about here in today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So there's not a lot of dueling in Jane Austen novels. However, there is a very important one in Sense and Sensibility between Colonel Brandon and Willoughby. Now, this is such a short little reference in the book that it is easy to overlook, and I think there's many Jane Austen fans who don't even realize that a duel took place. However, as is common with Jane Austen, the Willoughby-Brandon duel is actually very historically accurate and teaches us a lot about Regency-era dueling in general. So let us look at the book and then break down the Regency-era reality behind it. So in Sense and Sensibility, after Willoughby totally breaks Marianne's heart and Marianne is all like crying hysterically at home, we see Colonel Brandon come and talk to Eleanor and give her the entire backstory about his lost love Eliza, his ward Eliza, Willoughby seducing his ward Eliza, and then he gives us this fact. Eleanor asks him, "Have you ever seen Mr. Willoughby since you left him at Barton?" "Yes," he replied gravely. "Once I have. One meeting was unavoidable." Eleanor, startled by his manner, looked at him anxiously, saying, "What have you met him to?" "I could meet him no other way. Eliza had confessed to me, though most reluctantly, the name of her lover, and when he returned to town, which was within a fortnight after myself, we met by appointment, he to defend, I to punish his conduct. We returned unwounded, and the meeting, therefore, never got abroad." Eleanor sighed over the fancied necessity of this, but to a man and a soldier, she presumed not to censure it. So in the scene, we learn a lot about Regency duels. First of all, as we see Eleanor mention that Colonel Brandon thinks this is a necessity because he's a man and a soldier, that goes along with what we'd learned about in a recent video about the social honor code that underlied the entire reason there were duels. However, we also see Jane Austen including in this scene very minute details about how duels were usually fought. For example, about the fact that they were by appointment, also the publicity or lack of publicity around it, and the fact that nobody actually got hurt. Now, let us break down all of these aspects in Regency Dueling Etiquette 101. But before we dive into that, a word from this video's sponsor. So you guys know how much I love this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is a place to learn new creative skills or pick up a hobby. And one of my favorite things about Skillshare is that the classes are taught by real humans who love what they are teaching and they are passionate about it. And I recently took the class Learn Brushstrokes for Simple Watercolor Spring Flowers. And it was fun and it was pretty and it was easy, but I think most importantly, it just helped me get this sense of peace. I had actually been feeling a little bit stressed out and depressed earlier that day, but then once I sat down with this class and it was so easy to follow along with, and like the results were happening like right before my eyes. I'm painting really pretty flowers right now. It just did. It brought me so much tranquility, and I was just so thankful to the teacher. I was like, oh, she's like helped me unlock the skill of painting pretty flowers that now I can have for the rest of my life. I can go on and paint flowers all I want. Anyway, if you are looking to reconnect with your creativity, or maybe you just need to stop doom scrolling and get some tranquility on, then definitely check out Skillshare. The first of 500 people to click the link in my description or scan this QR code will get a 1-month free trial. Now, back to the video. Let us now get into Regency-era dueling. Now, first, I want to have a major disclaimer, which is this is not a tutorial. I do not want anyone to watch this video and then go challenge someone to a duel. Violence is a bad idea. Don't do it, guys. That is the ground rules here. Rather, we need to learn this stuff so we can better understand Regency era culture. So the first step in the dueling process was actually very important. So step one is be offended. Like we talked about in a recent video, this was an era where a man's honor and his social standing in front of other men was very, very important. And so if a man got offended by another man, he needed to do something about it, and his honor needed to be satisfied. So, for example, say a guy calls you a rascal. Your honor is now hurt, and you need to satisfy your honor by demanding that the other guy apologize. Because if you don't stand up for yourself and make the other guy apologize, everyone's going to look at you and be like, ooh, what a coward. I have no respect for him at all. And then the guy apologizes, and then now your honor has been satisfied, and no one thinks you're a coward, and you can move on with your day. However, in the giant spectrum of offenses to a guy's honor, everything from accidentally bumping into someone on the street and then quickly apologizing, all the way up to Colonel Brandon's ward Eliza being seduced by Willoughby, there's clearly a wide range, and thereby there was a wide range of levels of satisfaction from someone just apologizing to needing to fight each other at dawn with pistols. Basically, Willoughby's offense to Colonel Brandon's honor was so giant that he couldn't simply say sorry. But basically, while dueling was technically illegal on paper in England at this time, in everyday practice, it was not. As long as a judge and a jury thought a gentleman followed all of the proper dueling etiquette while doing so, the guy pretty much got off, even if he killed the person. And that is even if the dueler who killed the other party ever made it to trial. Most guys were never prosecuted. Those who were prosecuted were very rarely convicted. Those who were convicted usually were downgraded from murder to manslaughter and received 12 months or less in prison. So basically, on paper, if Colonel Brandon had killed Willoughby, he should have been hung for murder. However, in real life, if this had happened, nothing would have happened to him. As one author in the Edinburgh Review of 1814 put it, dueling law is a mere dead letter, for what, with the unwillingness of prosecutors, the connivance first of police officers, then of judges, the feelings of juries, and the corresponding feeling in the place of last resort, no instance is known of the law being executed against any person for being engaged in a duel, fought in what is called a fair manner. So here we see that if Colonel Brandon follows all of the etiquette and rules around dueling and he fights Mr. Willoughby in a fair manner, then nothing is going to happen to him. Now, of course, this does raise the question of why? A huge aspect of this, of course, was social class. As we've talked about, a gentleman would only ever duel another gentleman. This was not an activity that was really there for the lower classes. If you had a servant trying to duel another servant, a lot of people in society would look at that with ridicule and not even think that was a valid duel. Dueling was a major social class marker. So basically, gentlemen had this social right to duel, not by the letter of the law, but just because they were, the rich guys. As historian Victor Kiernan put it, in what he deemed questions of honor, the gentleman stood outside any social contract binding on the common man. He belonged to a superior social order, which made its own rules. That's right, Colonel Brandon and Willoughby belong to a superior social order that doesn't have to follow by this whole you can't kill the other guy just because you're mad at him rules. However, they did in fact need to follow the rules because a guy couldn't just walk up and shoot another guy and call it a duel. They needed to go through certain steps in order to establish that this was sort of protected, superior, gentlemanly behavior. Which brings us to step 2, which is appoint a second. So if a man wants to challenge another man to a duel, he really shouldn't just go up to him and challenge him in person. Rather, what he needs to do is go find one of his best friends and ask him to be the arbitrator, the negotiator, and the referee of this dispute. Now, his best friend's role actually has a name. This would be his second. You can kind of think of it as like the best man at a wedding, like a guy who would like go to his best friend and be like, hey, you want to be my best friend at my wedding? Only in a duel, he'd be like, hey, you want to be my second at a duel? Now, the second had a few different roles. One is he needed to handle all of the communications. He's the one who needs to go to Willoughby and be like, Colonel Brandon would like to fight a duel with you. Would you like to appoint your second I can talk to? And then Willoughby would also go to one of his best friends and be like, hey, Colonel Brandon's challenged me to a duel. Will you be my second? This is the name of his second. You guys can get together and like conference about this. So a lot of the important action at the stage is actually happening between these guys' best friends and seconds. But what are these seconds actually talking to each other about? Well, some of their main roles were to arbitrate and try to negotiate and de-escalate the situation and ultimately prevent a duel if at all possible. So for example, if the original offense had not been too dramatic and someone could just apologize in the situation, then the seconds could be like, hey, could your guy apologize? And the guy would be like, yeah, I'll try to get the guy to apologize. Okay. Now, of course, this step doubtlessly prevented a lot of duels in the era. However, one of the factors that made this sort of arbitration a little bit harder is the fact that the guy who caused the offense, the guy who is being challenged to the duel, also has his honor. And depending on all of the factors in the situation, sometimes if that guy apologized, it would look bad socially and like he was a coward who just rather would not fight a duel and was trying to get out of it. So basically, the seconds were constantly trying to work out a way of like, okay, this guy's honor needs satisfied. Your guy doesn't want to hurt his honor by apologizing. What can we do to like make them not try to kill each other? But if all of that fails and a duel is inevitable, the seconds need to start drilling down the details. So, for example, like, where is this going to happen? What are they going to fight with? Like, what's happening here with this duel? So first up, location. The seconds would have to be like, do we want to do this in a remote part of Hyde Park? Or do we want to sort of go out to like this random farm field right on the outskirts of London? Pick your location. What do we want here? However, one of the major overall factors for the location was, of course, that it was remote. They didn't want any passerby to accidentally get shot, nor a bunch of people to show up to watch this. Next, what time are they going to do it? Well, at dawn. That was pretty much the standard go-to time to have a duel. Next up was weapons. So of course the two major choices for weapons were swords or pistols. So swords had actually gone out of fashion when it came to duels right around the same time that men stopped wearing swords all the time in England, which was around the 1720s and 1730s. So a lot of gentlemen by Jane Austen's time did not have a lot of experience with fencing anymore, and thereby it was seen as a kind of unfair way to have a duel. So what was really popular and the main way to duel was with pistols. Now, of course, the dueling pistols did not need to be the latest technology. In fact, they should not be. Some families actually owned generational dueling pistols that were like ornate and fancy, and they kept at their house like in a case. And then when a duel happened, they were like, go get the dueling fancy pistol things. Now, you might be noticing a trend here, which is one of the underlying core aspects of dueling in the Regency era was that it be fair and then it be the least deadly possible. So for example, if a guy had a lot of fencing experience, it would be seen as ungentlemanly and dishonorable for him to challenge the other guy to a fencing duel if the other guy was not an equal level fencer. Likewise, it was unfair and dishonorable if you brought the latest in gun technology and the other guy just had a basic old pistol. Another key factor is that a gentleman should not practice before a duel. So if a guy gets or sends a duel challenge and then he goes out target practicing, that would look really, really bad on him and be completely dishonorable. So another key thing the seconds needed to do was hire a surgeon to be on hand. Now, of course, some doctors and surgeons were worried about actually attending a duel because they were technically illegal, even though very little was ever going to happen to them. So what they would do is they would just pretend that they accidentally were walking by while a duel happened. It was all happenstance, really. Something else the seconds needed to do was publicize the affair or hide it. So basically, depending on the people, what happened, how much like drama the guys loved, this is something that could actually end up in the papers before the duel even happens. Like the seconds could out there literally be sending articles to be published in the public newspaper being like, this guy, he hurt my friend's honor. He's going to challenge him to a duel. And they would just like run PR campaigns. However, that was more for like drama-loving gentlemen. As we see, Colonel Brandon and Willoughby's duel was never publicized ahead of time or after time, and their seconds decided to stay very quiet about it. Okay, now let us imagine that we are Colonel Brandon. Our second has done all this negotiating with Willoughby's second. They have decided that we are going to fight at dawn with pistols in a remote corner of Hyde Park. You know what Colonel Brandon needs to do next? He needs to, again, resist the urge to practice, but also show up. So sometimes guys who had a scheduled duel would just suddenly disappear and like leave the country. They'd be like, never mind. Of course, running away from a scheduled duel was like ultimate dishonor level, going to destroy a gentleman's reputation. However, that did not stop some of them. Some of them still ran away. Okay, it is finally the morning of the duel. Colonel Brandon and Mr. Willoughby both show up to the dueling location. Now, the next thing they're going to do is have their seconds sort of be the referees for the event. The seconds are going to together load the pistols. After loading the pistols, the next thing the seconds would do is actually measure out the distance apart the two men are to stand. Now, as you guys know, I did recently finally see Hamilton, actually in London, which was very cool. So of course we know in Hamilton, they have the guys who are dueling stand back to back, and then they walk so many paces away from each other, and then they turn and then they fire. Now, this was one option. However, dueling was kind of like dancing. There were like different ways you could go about it. But the most common was to have the distance pre-measured out by the seconds, and then like they would just put the guy in the spot where they're supposed to stand. So the standard distance for a duel was 12 paces. So basically a pace was 1 step, 2 step. Like, you know, both of your feet having moved. Now, this is very important because one of the things the seconds would actually negotiate and agree upon is if they were going to use the standard distance of 12 paces, or if their guys were just super bloodthirsty and like really mad at each other, sometimes they would insist on a shorter distance, right? They'd be like, we're only going to do this at 5 paces. The distance was very important because the closer they were to each other, the higher likelihood that they would actually hit each other and someone could die. So we're just going to assume that Colonel Brandon and Willoughby followed the general 12-pace rule here. So this is giving me the vibes of my curtsying tutorial because I'm now going to physically demonstrate. So the proper way to stand during a duel is with your side lined up to the other person, because this gives the other person a much smaller target to hit, right? They have to hit along the side of your body versus if you stood directly facing them like this, it provides a much larger target. Another thing about this stance is the arm, because when a guy's arm comes up to shoot at the guy, see how like my arm is kind of blocking a lot of my upper rib cage where my heart is and stuff. So basically, if a bullet hit here, it would more likely hit my arm versus it actually hitting into vital organs. Which is another reason having the seconds pre-measure out the 12 paces was preferred over the walking away from each other and turning, is because as a guy was getting ready for a duel, he could like really work on being like, okay, I'm perfectly lined up this way, versus if you have to like turn and shoot, it like you don't have the moment to be like all of these sort of like protective postures happening. Okay, once the two guys fighting the duel are the correct distance apart and in their proper posture, what they do is they have the gun in their hand down by their side. And when the seconds, who are again kind of the referees, yell fire, what he does is in one Smooth movement is raises and fires. This is very, very important. He does not aim. So again, the guy yells fire, raise, fire. There should be no hesitation or lag from him getting his arm up and him pulling the trigger. Because if there is hesitation there, if his arm comes up and then he aims, that is also very dishonorable and gentlemanly. A gentleman does not aim at his opponent. He just shoots. Now, of course, this brings up the whole question of like, does he actually shoot at the other guy? Does he fire into the air, or does he shoot at the ground? Now, of course, again, in Hamilton, which I feel like has become the pop culture touchstone for dueling, we see Hamilton insisting multiple times that a gentleman shoots into the air. Now, this was not a universally accepted concept. For some, if a guy actively shot into the air or the ground, this might be seen as making the duel kind of ridiculous. Like, what is the point of this entire thing if you guys are just going to both shoot in the air? So it really depended on the gentleman. Some shot into the air, some shot into the ground, and others just did the raise, shoot, and let chance happen as it will. Okay, so now they both shot at each other. What comes next? Well, it depends upon if anyone is injured and if the guy feels like his honor is satisfied. So if someone is injured, then the duel ends. Even if he's obviously not dead, even if it just barely grazed him, you generally stop a duel at the drawing of first blood, even back in the days of sword fighting. However, if no one is injured, this is where the question comes up of if a man's honor is satisfied. So basically, it's like, Colonel Brandon, do you feel like your honor is satisfied from having shot at Willoughby once? Now, generally speaking, the honorable thing to do was be like, yes, honor has been satisfied. We are now going to shake hands and part ways. However, some gentlemen were just so needing more satisfaction than that. So then they would decide that we need a second shot, and they would just go through this entire dueling process again. They'd get back in position, they'd reload the guns, and just shoot at each other again. So usually guys were satisfied with one shot. If not that, then 2 shots. Some guys would just go on like 5 shots or until someone actually got injured, but those guys were kind of questionable. Okay, so now let's just imagine Colonel Brandon is like, yes, because we have shot at each other once, my honor is satisfied. What do they do then? Well, in a very gentlemanly like manner, they shake hands, and then they part ways. Especially because I don't really imagine Colonel Brandon and Willoughby could ever really become friends. But ironically, a number of gentlemen, after having fought a duel, would be like, let's go to the pub and drink together. And it would start them off on like a lifelong friendship. I feel like this is especially true for the gentlemen who, like, kind of neither of them wanted to fight the duel, but because of the social honor thing, they both felt pressure to do it. Otherwise, they would look like cowards. And, like, they were just so, like, trauma bonded and, like, relieved that they were like, and now we're friends. Now, this is, of course, assuming that nobody got injured. And despite all the many measures of like standing far away and not aiming, etc., guys did get injured a fair amount of times. It is at that point that the surgeon steps in, they try to help the person. It is the gentlemanly thing to do to try to help the person you just shot at as well. Now, however, say you are the guy who got shot and you are dying and you know you're dying. What do? You tell everyone around you to forgive the guy who shot you and definitely not prosecute him. Because, again, like, you are a gentleman. You were doing the honorable thing. He was doing the honorable thing. You guys are above the law. So if Willoughby was shot and dying, he needed to be like, tell everyone not to hold Colonel Brandon responsible. We fought a fair fight in honor. And then he would, like, dramatically die. This is actually very legit. Guys would do this. Now, however, of course, if Colonel Brandon had killed Willoughby, what would have happened? Well, more than likely nothing. But some men who found themselves having killed the other guy in a duel would run away to France. Not because they were necessarily scared that they were going to face the death penalty, because again, that was highly unlikely, but gentlemen did not want to lower themselves to have ever spent time in prison, even if they get it for manslaughter and it's only going to be like 3 months. And as one historian has noted, this could especially be because prison in the Regency era had terrible conditions. But for the average guy fighting a duel, there was just going to be absolutely no consequences, and then they were just going to go on with the rest of their lives, possibly fight other duels, possibly be like, I'm never doing that again. So at the end of the day, Colonel Brandon had his honor restored, as did Willoughby. But my question is to you, if your best friend in the Regency era ever came to you and was like, will you be my second in a duel? Would you agree to it, or would you try to talk them out of it? Would you be like, yes, let me go set the date with the other second? Or would you be like, dude, no dueling for you? Also, a special shout out to my channel members. You guys are so awesome, and there are so many of you. And as always, guys, keep being awesome, because you're awesome. Bye!